So before we get into our actual message, I have to tag out because I'm not preaching this Sunday. Yeah, you guys don't get stuck with me this week. Hey, wait a second, Mayumi-san. Did you hear how enthusiastic that clapping was? Okay, well, before you guys can ruin my self-esteem, Josh, please come up here.
Thank you.
So we're going to pass it over to Pastor Josh. Thank you so much for giving us the sermon this morning.
Of course. So before we let Pastor Chelsea go and cry, let's all give her an encouraging hand to let her know how much we actually appreciate her. And you're going to appreciate her even more after this is done because you're really stuck with me. This is my third time getting to speak to you all, but this is actually my first time with people here. The first two times were during the quarantine, so when we were having only online services. So this is new to me, so this will be fun, I hope. So last Sunday, Pastor Chelsea talked about the events that followed Jacob and Esau's reunion. After their heartfelt meeting, Esau asked Jacob to travel with him. Jacob said that his traveling company was tired and they needed to rest, so they would catch up later. But here's the thing, he didn't. Whether it was out of fear or some other reason, we saw Jacob deceiving his brother and going somewhere else. This is significant not only because he chose to go somewhere different than his brother, but also because he was in turn choosing to go to a land other than the one that God had called him to. This act of disobedience ended up having dire consequences for everyone around him. His family was influenced by false gods, his daughter was assaulted, and in turn, some of his sons destroyed the city in retaliation. These tragic events were only able to happen because Jacob had taken his family out of God's will and into a land they were never supposed to be in the first place. However, Pastor Chelsea also encouraged us that stepping out of God's will isn't the end for us. We won't be exempt from the consequences of our actions, but we can still return to God and get back on track. God reached out to Jacob in the midst of everything. He called Jacob back to him and directed him back to Bethel, which is the place where God had first revealed himself to Jacob. But Jacob had to leave behind the things that were separating him from God. He had to let go of his false idols, his moral failures, and his sinful living. God guided Jacob back to Bethel and protected them from their enemies on their journey. He eventually led Jacob back to his home, where he was reunited with his father Isaac and his brother Esau sometime before Isaac's death. Their families lived together in the land of Canaan until the land could no longer support both households. Esau and his family moved away, and Jacob remained in the land of his father. Today, we're going to be following the story of Jacob and his sons, but more specifically, his son Joseph. We'll start with the first point. We need to choose who we glorify when God blesses us. Genesis 37, 2-4 says, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, which is Jacob's other name, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now, how many of you here have a favorite child? I was interested to see if anyone would actually admit to it. My siblings and I would argue about who the favorite child is. Let me take a moment to introduce them. That's my brother carrying me there. His name is Mason. That's my sister right there next to me. Her name is Amber. That's my wife. You all probably know her. Her name is Erin. And that's my niece. Her name is Alyssa. So that's a couple people of my family. And my siblings and I, we would argue about who's the favorite, but we usually wouldn't claim to be the favorite child, but we would argue over who we think the favorite is out of everyone, like all the others. Sometimes we would say, or sometimes they would say that I'm the favorite. Sometimes we'd say that my sister is the favorite, but we knew my brother was definitely not the favorite. Mom and Dad, you're probably watching, and I know that you love us all equally. My great-grandmother, on the other hand, who we affectionately called Gigi, was a different story. It was no secret that my sister was her favorite, and it makes sense. She was the first great-grandchild on that side of the family. My great aunt was taking care of my great grandmother at the time and knew that it was something we all joked about. So when we visited on Christmas, my great aunt insisted that Gigi loved us all equally and that no one was more special than the other. But when we got our Christmas presents passed out, we all got the exact same thing, except for my sister. She got one extra thing that my brother and I didn't get. It was a tiny little charm that said, "You're special." All this to say, when people do have a favorite child, grandchild, relative, whatever it may be, they're usually not very good at hiding it. Jacob was no exception. He gave Joseph, his favorite son, an ornate robe adorned with many colors. It was a kind of flashy gift that says, "You're special." And I understand why he would be the favorite. It makes sense. He was the firstborn of Rachel. She was the woman that Jacob wanted to marry all along, the one he worked 14 years for. On top of that, Rachel tragically had not made it back to Canaan with the rest of the family. She passed away during the birth of her second son, Benjamin. Unfortunately, this wasn't a situation where the siblings could joke around about being the favorite like my siblings. Joseph's brothers hated him for it. They had no kind words to share with him. In the midst of everything, God began to speak to Joseph through his dreams. Verses 5-8 say, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf.' His brothers said to him, 'Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words." Now, what God shared with Joseph was something a lot of people don't receive. He received a prophecy of his future. That's exciting. However, sharing it with his brothers, who he already shared a contentious relationship with, was probably not the best idea. Now, if this was a one-time thing, we might be able to dismiss it as him just being naive. He might not have known how his brothers were going to react. But let's continue to verses 9-11. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves on the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Joseph received another dream from God with a similar meaning. He related again, only this time he knew full well how his brothers were going to react. Even Jacob had to get involved and rebuke his favorite son. Notice how verse 11 says, "But his father kept the saying in mind." We know from the past chapters that Jacob was no stranger to God speaking. He knew about God's calling and promises. He knew when God said something will happen, that it will happen. So he didn't dismiss the dream that Joseph received from God. But as a father, he recognized the unhealthy pride that Joseph was showing. God's blessings are amazing, but we should never use God's blessings to elevate ourselves above others or put others down. His blessings are not about us. They're about what God does in us or for us. In this instance, Joseph was hyper-focused on the end meaning of his dream. One day, his entire family would bow down to him. He didn't realize that things don't always go as smoothly as we think that they will. Here's a spoiler. One day, Joseph's family does indeed bow down to him, but it's a bit of a bumpy road to get there. Let's look at the first bump in the road. Jacob sends Joseph to go check up on his brothers as they are tending to their flock in Shechem. Now, that name might sound familiar. You may remember that it's the name that Pastor Chelsea had a really fun time trying to pronounce last week. It's also the place where Jacob was called out to return to his roots. Even though he left, we see they never fully cut ties with the city. It is on this trip to his brothers that Joseph's hardships began. Joseph's brothers moved on from Shechem to Dothan, and Joseph headed there to find them. Let's read what happens next. Verses 18-19 say, "They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, 'Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams.' That became very bad, very quick. We've talked before about patterns that have shown up in Abraham's family line, how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all used deception at one point or another due to fear in their life. Here we see another pattern. Like his father before him, Joseph's sibling relationship was broken to the point of murderous intent. But unlike Joseph, way more than one sibling had it out for him. They hated him for his status. They hated him for his dreams. They were disregarding the word of the God of their father. Instead, they wanted to snuff out any chance of it ever becoming a reality. Fortunately for Joseph, he had at least one brother looking out for him. Verses 21 through 24 say, "But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, 'Let us not take his life.' And Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore them to his father.' So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it." This brings me to my second point. We have the ability to positively impact the situation of others. I can't help but think of the movie 12 Angry Men. For those of you who aren't familiar with the film, it's about 12 members of a jury deciding the verdict in a trial of an 18-year-old young man. Whether through the evidence, flippancy, or personal prejudice, 11 members of the jury are ready to immediately vote guilty. One holds out, though, believing there is enough reasonable doubt for the young man not to be convicted, and the vote has to be unanimous. This leads to the discussion that is the driving force of the entire film. Similarly, in this situation, Joseph's brothers were ready to kill him on the spot, until Reuben spoke up on behalf of Joseph. Sometimes it only takes someone speaking out to change someone's circumstances for the better. A few months ago, Pastor Chelsea talked about when Abraham rescued his brother-in-law Lot from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah back in chapters 18 and 19 of Genesis. The cities had called down the wrath of God, and Lot was going to be swept up in the destruction. Only because Abraham spoke out for Lot was he able to not be struck down with the rest of the city. We see another example of this in Jesus' ministry. In Mark 2, 1 through 5, it says, "A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, and not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him in to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat that the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, 'Son, your sins are forgiven.' Jumping to verse 11, Jesus says, 'I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home.' He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, 'We have never seen anything like this.' It was physically impossible for this man to get to Jesus on his own. Without his friends intervening for him, he most likely would have been paralyzed for his entire life. Instead, his friends brought him and bypassed a crowd because they knew what he needed was an encounter with Jesus. Because of their faith, their friend was healed, and Jesus' glory was able to be seen by everyone around them. Similar to the paralyzed man and to Lot, Joseph was spared because somebody spoke out on his behalf. I do think it's interesting that it was Reuben of all the brothers that spoke out for Joseph. If anyone had a reason to despise Joseph, it was him. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn, the first child of Leah. If anyone should have the blessings, the favoritism, the multicolored coat, it was him. But he had compassion for his brother. He was able to dissuade them from outright murder to just throwing Joseph into a pit. In their mind, he would still die there while not actually having to shed his blood. In Reuben's mind, he would be able to rescue Joseph from the pit at a later time. Unfortunately, it was not enough to completely resolve the situation. Let's continue reading. Genesis verses 26 through 28 say, "Then Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him. For he is our own brother, our own flesh.' And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt." Wow, how thoughtful of Judah. We can't kill our own brother. That would be terrible. Let's make some money instead. Reuben had successfully spared Joseph's life, but while he was away, he wasn't able to prevent his other brothers from selling him. His intentions were noble, but his methods were lacking. Reuben tried to deceive his brothers into putting Joseph into a situation he could be rescued from. We don't know why he didn't outright contest the idea of harming Joseph. Maybe he was afraid of how his brothers would have seen him. Maybe he thought they would want to harm him instead. We can't know for sure. What we do know is that Reuben's half measures still allowed his brother to be sold off and brought far away from his family. We end today's chapter on kind of a low note. The brothers return and tell their father, Jacob, that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. This sends him into a state of deep mourning. Meanwhile, Joseph is brought to Egypt and is sold as a servant to an Egyptian officer. In the coming weeks, we'll see how God intervenes and ultimately brings his word on Joseph's life to pass. Have you allowed any blessings in your life to elevate yourself instead of reflecting God's love? Let's remember that God's blessings are a reflection of his gracious character and should never be taken advantage of. Is there a situation in your life that's around you that you might be able to speak life into? Whether it's through physical intervention or prayer, let's be on the lookout this week for situations we may be able to positively impact. If you'd like to know more about following Jesus or have any questions, please let us know. And if you have any prayer requests, you can send us a message or you can tell one of us in person. We would love to support and encourage you. Let's pray together. Dear Lord, I just thank you for today, and I just thank you for another opportunity for us to gather together. And I thank you for your word and your blessings. And I just pray that we always remember where the blessings come from and that we can use your blessings to in turn bless others. Just thank you for everything you do for us, Lord. In your name I pray, amen.